Space here on WRFG Atlanta. Before we get started, we of course have a little itty bitty disclaimer because, well, you'll see. All right, be right back.
WRFG operates on the frequency of 89.3 megahertz as authorized by the Federal Communications Commission. Opinions expressed on WRFG do not necessarily represent the opinions of Radio Free Georgia Broadcasting, Inc., its staff, or volunteers. This program contains language and/or information which may be strong for some listeners. Portions of this program are pre-recorded. Discretion is advised.
Welcome. You are listening to Solution Space here on WRFG Atlanta. My name is Adam Wadley, and on this week's program, I'd like to talk to you about the some of the demonstrations I've been taking part in the past week, and also highlight one which is coming up this weekend. So, yesterday there was a demonstration outside of the Israeli embassy, or maybe it's the Israeli consulate. Excuse me. Outside the Israeli consulate here in Atlanta, Georgia. I attended that. Actually, I got a little confused, and I went the day before as well. So I went on Tuesday and Wednesday to the Israeli consulate. But yesterday there was a larger demonstration. There were people who were protesting, of course, the nature of Israel's military operation with respect to Palestine, with respect to Hamas. As part of course, the ongoing situation, which, very much so escalated on October 7th of last year with, a terror attack slash, act of violent resistance organized by Hamas. And Hamas is, actually, I think I saw this week, Hamas is supported by countries such as Turkey. They're more long-standingly known also to be affiliated with Iran. So this conflict between Israel, Palestine, of course, is we've discussed already in terms of, a second flashpoint in an ongoing sort of escalating military emergency situation, right? So we already had the situation going on with Ukraine and Russia, where you already had basically, you might think about, we have NATO plus. So there's NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance set up following World War II by the United States and other Western colonial powers in order to, safeguard their hegemony and, domination of the world's wealth and resources. And then on the other hand, these days, of course, you have increasingly an alliance, or they don't call it an alliance, but a strategic partnership between your China and your Russia, and Iran is, I don't know if you'd say it's the third country to sort of put on that list. Certainly, obviously, North Korea also very close to the agglomerations that we call China and Russia. I've been using those a little bit too naturally, but anyway, so in Ukraine. In Russia, we already have, NATO facing off against, not exactly the BRICS, India is not so strongly with China and Russia, but, this China, Russia, Iran axis, if you might say. So this sort of triple alliance, which of course, poses a big challenge, right, to NATO plus and our dreams of world domination, or whatever we might be wanting to talk about there. So we already had that going on with Ukraine and Russia and NATO. That's been going on, of course, since February of 2022. And then since October of last year, of course, we've had this second flashpoint. Now, these are just two things which really come to the top of attention. Of course, there's lots of conflicts raging around the world. Notably, there's an ongoing civil war in Sudan right now. And this past year, I went to a new church, basically. I was checking out the Mennonite Church of Atlanta. They were very welcoming. Thank you very much. They sent me home with some bread. That was very kind of them. But I checked out the Mennonites because I was researching into Calvinism, into Anabaptism. I was researching into the religion of one John Brown. John Brown was somebody who, attempted to start an armed insurrection, and his raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 is considered to be one of the catalysts toward the American Civil War. But he's sometimes remembered fondly because his actions arguably, helped Abraham Lincoln get elected, but helped bring on the end of chattel slavery, or the official end, right, of chattel slavery in the United States. And so sometimes, this John Brown character is held to be somewhat of a role model. I guess that'll be one of the themes of this episode. You might recall, or you might have seen around, people talking about a crisis of masculinity, talking about things like the demoralization of young men, of course, the incel phenomenon, which basically refers to, people who don't have success in romance, especially men, right? And then who then sort of become resentful, especially against the other gender or the other sex or whatever. So men being resentful of women, basically. And on the other hand, who are the male role models, right? Who are we looking up to these days, right? We got your Andrew Tates, we got your Jordan Petersons, we got your Elon Musks, right? We got your Donald Trumps. We have these sorts of role models for men who arguably, leave a lot to be desired, right? So this is going to be a lingering theme. But so in contradistinction to all these, men who we are lucky enough to share the planet with at this time, we can open up the idea of John Brown, right, as another model. And I guess in that we can also put into conversation Aaron Bushnell, right? Aaron Bushnell is the person, the Air Force person who recently set themselves on fire outside of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. So in both the Aaron Bushnell and the John Brown case, you have basically this idea of self-sacrifice, sacrificing for the idea of justice, for an idea of social integrity. And yeah, so that's something that we're going to be opening up. But I think, of course, this idea, calling it willingness to sacrifice, you can also call it being suicidal. You can call it being nuts, or, right, mental illness. Certainly people have talked about mental illness with respect to both Aaron Bushnell and John Brown. But this week, I would like to talk to you a little bit about my grandfather, who I never met in the flesh, because, my American grandfather. So I've talked to you before on this program about some about my heritage, right? So I'm half German. I was born in Germany, outside of Hamburg. People always ask, since my mom is German and my dad's American, people ask if my dad was in the army, which is kind of a very funny question because he very much so was not in the army. It became a very big sticking point between my father and my grandfather, because my grandfather wanted my dad to volunteer to go to Vietnam because my dad wasn't drafted into Vietnam. But my grandfather thought he should volunteer to go, right? He should volunteer to go to Vietnam, which is, considered one of the quagmires and, moral blights on America, or whatever, quote unquote America. And so my dad didn't want to go. He was more of a hippie type. And, they didn't speak for years. This was a big blow to the relationship between my father and his father. So that's going to be an interesting aspect, I think, of this conversation. But anyway, so, I'm half German. I was born in Germany. And on my mom's side, my grandparents were both raised during the Third Reich, right? So my grandparents were born in like 1927, 1929. And so they were both, in the Hitler Youth. My grandfather was conscripted. Technically, he volunteered, but, my grandfather was 17. This is my German grandfather. My grandfather was 17 in 1944. So I'm not trying to make excuses here, but just to give some context, Germany's losing the war in 1944. And, so my grandfather's 17 years old, and the SS comes to town and is like, look here, you're gonna volunteer to join the SS. That's what's gonna happen next. So that's what my grandfather did. And he went and fought a little bit on the Western Front, but he also took part in one of the final German offensive military campaigns of World War II called Spring Awakening, which was basically where they invaded Hungary. They tried to go and get up some oil resources, and of course that didn't work out. But of course, Nazi Germany, toward the end of the war, once they realized they couldn't win, the other main thing that was going on that time was the intensification, acceleration of the Holocaust and genocide. And so, I'm not exactly sure what my grandfather took part in, but safe to say, he at least witnessed, if not participated in, some atrocities. Anyway, so you've heard about that. I've talked about that before on this radio show. And so that is a reason why, when it comes to topics of Nazism or, ethno-nationalism or, things of this nature, or the topic of genocide, right? Because genocide is a topic which comes up with the idea that Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians right now. So when the topic of genocide comes up, it very much so resonates with me deeply, but I don't know if I should say I have a conflicted relationship with it. Certainly genocide is not good. Mass murder is not. I was just watching Interstellar, the movie, last night again, technically this morning, and there's a line in Interstellar where Michael Caine is talking about how they set up NASA again. Because in Interstellar, anyway, they shut it down because there's such shortages of everything. But in order to keep up the hope of being able to solve problems by going to space, they keep NASA up. Anyway, so he says, once people realized that killing was not a long-term solution, then they started up NASA again and the idea of scientific exploration. So that is one thing that I would say. Killing people is not a long-term solution to anything. And we're already seeing that, in the idea that, if you kill people, you're radicalizing them, right? And so this is true both of Hamas's actions, for example, just pulling back to the Palestinian Israeli situation, right? So Hamas, killed 1,000 people, and committed atrocities on October 7th. And, that really, you want to go back to the Old Testament, right? Book of Exodus, talk about the hardening of hearts, right? So in the book of Exodus, God hardens the heart of Pharaoh so that he won't let the people go, right? So if you want to talk about people's hearts being hardened, I think that we can say that something like this is happening, right, in Israel, right? With the what should we say, very horrifying attack, which happened on October 7th. It sort of makes people very lack empathy, right? People do not care that it's like, oh, well, 30,000 people died. Well, this is war, right? This is the kind of situation people have. But on the other hand, right, as I just said, Israel, and people are debating these numbers, right? Some people say it's not 30,000 people dead, it's 200,000 people dead or something like this. So Israel, is trying to kill Hamas, right? And so it's leveling so much of Palestine. And so the question is, for every member of Hamas who is killed, or for every terrorist, right, or fighter or whatever, for every military person who's killed by Israel, how many people are being inspired, to be against Israel, basically? And this is a problem really that all states face. And I think, a lot of times when people talk about, atrocities committed by Israel and so on and so forth, people will bring up this idea of, you're holding Israel to a standard that you're not holding other countries to. And I would just say, well, I can empathize with that to an extent, but I also like to take the bite out of that by saying, this is a problem faced by NATO, which is being faced by Russia, which is being faced by China, right? Which is being faced by every major power in the world. And it's basically the idea that, killing people, using oppression, it creates enemies. And, as much as this is part of what's tearing things apart, this is, I think, also represents an opportunity in the sense that, there hopefully can be an opening for different ideas of how to address the sorts of problems that we have in the world. So I'll be talking about that for the rest of the show. This is a call-in program. So if you would like to call in and join the conversation, please feel free to do so. Telephone number here is 404-523-8255. 8989. Again, that telephone number is 404-523-8989. I'll be right back after this message.
Donate your car, truck, or boat. It's easy. We can put it to good use and you get a tax receipt. Call our toll-free number. We pick up your vehicle, running or not. We send you a tax receipt. It takes just a few minutes. Call toll-free 844-WRFG-CAR. That's 844-973-4227 to arrange a free pickup. Proceeds will benefit WRFG 89.3 FM, WRFG.org, your station for progressive information and hand-picked quality music. Thank you.
Welcome back. You are listening to Solution Space here on WRFG Atlanta. So I just talked to you again about my the German side of my family, but I wanted to talk to you about my American grandfather a little bit more. I already mentioned a little bit about the drama with him and my father, but this is relevant to the theme of Lockheed because my grandfather on my dad's side worked for Lockheed Martin. Well, I guess it wasn't Lockheed Martin at the time. He worked for Lockheed. And so this Saturday, there's going to be a protest at Lockheed Martin outside of Atlanta. So that's why I bring this up. So that's going to be on March 16th. I don't have the specific information for you at this time. I believe it's being organized by this group called the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Maybe we'll get into how, me talking about this protest and, going to their protest at the Israeli consulate should not be interpreted as me endorsing this group or the messages that they are spreading, right? Because it's really more so that I find it to be powerful just to attend protests. I sort of make my own demonstration, often to, the security forces, the police, the whatever sorts of people, might be there. I sort of make my own demonstration. And a lot of the rhetoric which is used for me isn't necessarily all that helpful. It's very antagonistic. It's talking about how, the people in power are evil and genocide Joe and all this stuff. So anyway, just to say, I mentioned that just so you can maybe find out about this protest, which is happening on Saturday, March 16th at Lockheed. You can also keep your eye, of course, on the Solution Space page on WRFG.org. So that's WRFG.org/solution-space. So if you search for the Solution Space show hub or whatever on WRFG.org, you'll find a link to my Substack. And if you keep up with that between now and Saturday, I'll definitely post an update if I get specific information about when and where this protest will be taking place. But it's something which strikes me personally because, I just went to this protest yesterday, which was at the Israeli consulate, right? So already, we have the theme where Israel is being charged with genocide. And of course, this resonates with me. This strikes me very deeply because, my grandfather on my mom's side and both my grandparents were raised in the Third Reich. And my grandfather very well may have helped participate in the Holocaust, right? Which is considered obviously genocide against Jewish people. And now, the whole situation with Israel and Palestine is this sort of reversal, right? Where it's like now the Israelis are being charged with genocide against Palestinians. Some people find that to be, of course, very offensive and anti-Semitic or something like this, and trivializing the Holocaust or something like this. There's actually some really interesting quotes you can find if you search about the Eli Academy, where there have been rabbis within Israel who have said things like, well, actually the ideology of Nazi Germany was pretty correct. The only problem was they were against Jewish people instead of being on Jewish people's side. So again, going back to the theme of Jewish supremacy, which was opened up by Yuval Noah Harari, who's, an Israeli public intellectual historian. He talks about how the threat of Jewish supremacy is very real. And there are basically ideologues of Jewish supremacy who then adopt things like Nazi talking points, or, basically say the Nazis had it all figured out, except that they were against Jewish people. So these things are quite complicated. Anyway, so already, half of my lineage or whatever, my mom's side, the German side of my family, these topics are resonating with me because of that lineage. But then I find out that there's going to be a protest at Lockheed. And Lockheed, as I said before, is the company that my grandfather worked for on my dad's side. So this whole thing is very, I'm not going to say it's personal to me. Of course, this is not about me, but the many of the themes and the topics, the resonances, the companies, the countries, and the religions, all these kinds of things, all these things are resonating with my own personal life story. And this goes into a topic. This is a topic I've wanted to talk about more extensively for a long time, but it's basically the interplay between biography and history. Right? If you want to talk about it, like, our stories are all written in the pages of history, right? Like, history is a book, right? But, if a day is a page, right? Then, all of our stories are overlapping. They're all on this one page, right? And so if I look back, if I'm thinking about things that have traumatized me in my life, or my happiest memories, or, what makes life worth living for me, if anything does, right? All these things are written in the same book as history, right? The history, which is the book, where the Holocaust is written, which is where Genghis Khan is written, right? Which is where World War II, the rest of World War II is written, right? And, where Babies with Cancer is written, right? Where, all of the suffering and all of the atrocities, all of the pain, all of the, what gets called evil, right? That's all in the same book that, everything that I considered about myself is written. And I think, just as I'm trying to talk about here, my personal, I don't know if I should say involvement, but, the interplay between, my family history and thinking about these ongoing conflicts. I think in the same way, you can probably have similar kinds of stories, right? Obviously not exactly the same, because your grandparents didn't come from where my grandparents came from, probably, right? We all have very different stories. We have different ways in which we have emerged out of history, which is to say we have different parents. Our parents were in different circumstances. Not just parents, but caregivers, right? Many of us are not raised by our parents, right? Our biological parents, and so on and so forth. So, and we come from different countries, and those countries have different ideologies, and those, there's different religions. And so, but all of those things, right, have a history, right? It's not just I happen to be Hindu. It's not just I happen to be, Calvinist, right? These things have a long history in themselves, which again also involve wars and, nationalisms and all these things, and a million biographies, right? History itself is just made up of the actions of individual people and the interplay between them. So this dynamic going on between biography and history, I think, is very profound, right? Where, all of our lives are influenced by the historical context, by the social context, by what's going on, which led to us. And that's also the field, in a more optimistic or something like that. Another way I talk about it, that's also our canvas, right? If you want to say, our lives are works of art, or at least we have the ability to try and be creative with our lives. We basically have the ability to try and influence what's going on. We get to act, right? We get to take action. But the only way that you can act is within a context, right? The only way you can paint, well, I mean, it's not the only way you can paint, but just imagine, is that you have a canvas, right? You have something to paint on, and you have something which is your paint, right? So much of what I'm trying to do with this show and so on and so forth is to inspire people, and also help myself develop, this mentality that what there is for us to do is to think in ourselves, reflect on, where am I coming from? What is the situation that I'm in? What is, it's not, the world is not just a canvas, right? It's not just something which is here for me to, talk into this microphone, right? The world is, it's a canvas which can sneak up behind you, right? It's a world where, there can be nuclear bombs, right? There can be nuclear war. There can be, increasingly, drones powered by artificial intelligence. So it's like, what am I going to add to the painting today? Because I might not be here tomorrow. The canvas might not be here tomorrow, right? This is part of the dynamic. But for all of us, I'm trying to encourage us all to think about, being creative, taking very seriously, our responsibility. But I think it's also a way of unlocking deeper parts of joy. I think that might be maybe an unintuitive way of saying it, but I think it is important not to just think about it in terms of duty, because I'm eventually going to start talking more about my grandfather, and think about him. My grandfather's idea that, my father should go to Vietnam, right? Because it's a matter of family honor, which, let me just take a time out. Like, many people allege that America committed genocide in Vietnam, right? Not to mention Laos and Cambodia. And, all the bombs that were dropped there, more bombs than were dropped in all of World War II, America dropped on these countries that had no ability to strike the United States, right? And Agent Orange, right? And, the American soldiers, our own people or whatever, got cancer because of what we were using. And part of the reason why the Vietnam War ended is because of this thing called fragging, right? Which is where enlisted people in Vietnam would blow up their own commanding officers because they didn't want to fight in this war and they didn't see the point, really. So in that, my grandfather thought that my father should volunteer to go participate in this as a matter of family honor, right? And obviously there are probably still people who, are of two minds, or, who think the Vietnam War is the right thing to do or whatever. But the point of what I'm trying to talk about is basically just that I think it is a challenge for us to overcome. That many of us think that, what is honorable is to kill people, right? What is honorable, apparently, is to simplify our thinking and forget, all empathy, forget all complexity, and just think, well, there's bad people and they got to die and we got bombs, right? And people think that is what honor is about. And, that's what responsibility is. So bringing up this idea of joy, I think that basically if we're open to it, there are aspects of joy or something like this, which are opened up when we are able to basically deal creatively with the horror which is going on in the world. Like, for example, making a movie about a war, right? In some ways, this could be, you could construe this as violence. I'm not saying anything is purely good. But what I'm trying to say is there's certain pleasure that you might get, or, just the idea that you could touch people, right? By making a movie about war, or a movie about heartbreak, or writing a poem about your trauma, right? About how your parent died, or, about some ancestor of yours, that the legacy is complicated, right? But if that person hadn't existed, you wouldn't be here, right? This kind of thing, these kinds of very tricky things, if we deal creatively in that and we connect with each other about these kinds of things, that can also open up joy, basically. And for me, it really feels like that's what there is to do. And in that sense, it's the kind of thing you may as well enjoy it, because that is what there is for us to do. There is for us to try and be creative and make new sorts of connections and, dissolve, intervene in conflicts by being willing to be open, by being willing to take risks, by being willing to be judged. Because in those senses, those are the kinds of risks that I think are really going to get us someplace. And at a certain level, that also involves the willingness to die, right? To risk your life, right? And going back to Aaron Bushnell, or going back to John Brown. But fundamentally, I don't think that the most important thing is that, we're opening ourselves up to die, folks, right? That's not the point here. Because the question is, if you engage in this kind of space, right, is it more so that you just want to die and you're looking for an excuse to do it, a way, that's not as dishonorable as some other ways that you're considering? Or is it more so that there's something that we want to do, and we want to do it so much that we are willing to risk our lives? Or, again, as I was saying before, this canvas. It's like you're painting on the wall of a painting, right? And the cave is crumbling. Sorry, you're painting on the wall of a cave, and the cave is crumbling, right? That's sort of our situation right now, right? Where it's like, I don't have to risk my death, right? The whole history is, what to say? The world, quote unquote, but also just like my biological life is at risk of ending every day anyway, right? Nuclear bombs can fall. I don't have to set myself on fire. The world is being set on fire as we speak, right? So also with this sort of understanding, you know, it's, again, not a question of just like, it's not a question of courting death, right? It's not about seeking out death, but realizing that, death is at stake, right? And people are dying right now. Since I've been talking to you, people have been dying in Palestine. People have been dying in Ukraine. People have been dying in Sudan. People have been dying in Ethiopia. People have been dying in the United States of friggin' America, right? Of drug overdose and suicide and murder and starvation and disease that's untreated, you know? And that's just a fact of life. And whether or not I'm out here risking my life, that's really of secondary importance. What's most important is, are we willing to face what we're afraid of that might actually help? And so what I'm trying to say is that I think what that often has to do with is us being open, right? Us being willing to go places, us being willing to talk about how we are implicated, not just saying, Genocide Joe and, evil America or whatever, but, like, I'm implicated in racism. I'm implicated in sexism, right? Like I've been sexist to people. I've been racist to people, right? Like I have had contempt for people. I have, projected my anger and feelings of worthlessness, right, onto other people. And, I try to do that, when other people aren't around. But, I'm not separate from the problems of this world. And I think that opening up space to be vulnerable and address that, I think, is exactly the kind of thing that might help us dislodge some of these very entrenched issues. But I've got to interrupt myself here to remind you that you are listening to Solution Space here on WRFG Atlanta. Solution Space is basically a show inspired by the idea of, everybody thinks things are going very badly, right? You might think that it's because of the woke communist mind virus, or you might think it's because of fascist, neo-Nazi, whatever, but increasingly, people are very pessimistic. We got doomerism on the rise, and we also, have there's anti-doomerism, right? So doomer is like you're very pessimistic, but I've seen recently on Reddit, there's a page called Optimists Unite, right? So people don't want to be pessimistic; they want to be optimistic. But the way people try to be optimistic is just to paint everything as though it's great. Right? Oh, look at all these charts. Look, all the lines are going in the right direction. Oh my goodness. So here on Solution Space, we are looking for the window, right? The solution space is the window that we're trying to hit, right? It's like, instead of thinking about, oh my God, billions of people are going to die this century. It's like, well, we're on track for billions of people to die this century. How many people are going to survive the 21st century? That's the question. And the way things often look, maybe nobody's going to survive, right? And so there's cause for concern. Let's put it that way, right? But we can be optimistic, right? But so solution space is a term that I draw from mathematical optimization, problem solving. And the way in which the solution space works is that the solution space is all the possibilities that fit the constraints of the situation. So if you're not fitting the constraints of the situation, you're not really solution oriented, right? And I mean, solution is kind of a nebulous term. We're not necessarily going to solve everything, but words are all a little bit tricky. But so the point of what I'm trying to say is that you can be optimistic, right? There's no problem with being optimistic, but the where the balance comes in is that we need to be realistic. We need to be realistic about what are the constraints that we're facing. So if your solution, right, oh, we're going to make America great again, right? Or we're going to organize the proletariat and, overthrow the bourgeoisie, or, whatever, a lot of these solutions, quote unquote, right, are not realistic. They're not looking at the constraints that we're actually faced with. The constraints, like, we're here on the planet with a lot of people who disagree with us, right? And who have their own interpretation. Right. And as it comes to Marxian class conflict or whatever, there are entrenched bureaucracies. Right. There is the military industrial complex. There is Lockheed Martin. Right. And we don't just have, drones and nuclear bombs to worry about, because there's actually another aspect of Lockheed that I wanted to mention, and I need to get into talking about my grandfather a little bit here. But Lockheed is also a company which is involved in basically the UFO phenomenon. So in addition, again, there's going to be a protest this Saturday outside of the Lockheed near Atlanta. And I guess you can check out the SPL, the party, or the PSL, the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Again, I don't endorse this organization or their talking points, but this is who's sort of organizing this protest. And you can also, again, follow up with the experimental unit Substack that you can find on the Solution Space page of WRFG.org in order to find out more information about this. But so they're protesting Lockheed because Lockheed's involved in supplying Israel with bombs and other things related to the war or the annihilationist tactics, the destruction of Palestine, which is going on right now. But also Lockheed Martin, right, is also involved with the UFO phenomenon. So there's a part of Lockheed called Skunk Works, which refers to their, highly advanced, developmental thing for airplanes or whatever. They're highly advanced, technology division. And so Lockheed Skunk Works is supposedly, if you listen to people who investigate UFOs, also, a former senator, what's the leader of the Senate called? The majority leader, I guess, Harry Reid, a Democratic, dude, of the Democratic Party. Harry Reid is well known as being one of these figures in the U.S. government who's really curious about UFOs. And so we're supposed to call them UAPs now, unidentified anomalous phenomenon or something like that. But anyway, UFO is what people sort of recognize. So that's what I'm saying. So Harry Reid has said that Lockheed Martin probably has UFOs, right? So it's a very interesting dynamic to me where, Lockheed is being protested because of involvement in Palestine. Of course, it's a military industrial company. It is joined at the hip with the United States government, but it's also involved in these, skunk works type of operations, which is another thing which is just sort of a little bit weird about our time, right? It's not just, that, I don't know, nationalism's on the rise and there's going to be World War III and all this stuff. But in the middle of this, it's like there's UFOs going on. What's going on with this? And even if you don't, is it aliens? Is it interdimensional beings? Is it just very advanced technology that is being kept a secret? Oh dear. Somebody... I'm also live streaming this on Twitch. So maybe somebody just did something. I don't know. Point of the story is, though, that... this is an aspect of what's going on, which is weird, right? And this idea of, anomalous phenomenon and technology, which is a secret, whether it's because, there's people aside from what we call the state, or whether it's just, very advanced scientific research, which is kept a secret, the idea of a deep state, right? There's a state within a state, which is keeping these secrets. Either way, this is, again, playing at the sort of dynamic which is going on in our time of like, well, who's even making these decisions, right? Who's even in charge, right? We don't even really understand that, right? And it's so easy, of course, following that awareness, that we don't even really know. I mean, and then, people will say, of course, nobody's in charge, right? There's fights all the way, and then, okay, sure. But in terms of like, who, if things are on a need-to-know basis, right? Who needs to know the most, right? Who's sitting on the most secrets, right? Who knows what's in the skunk works? Who really knows whether Lockheed has UFOs or not, right? There are some people who really know, right? Harry Reid might not even really know, right? A senator, right? Of course, the whole elected representatives of America, right? That's not really worth the Constitution that it's printed on, right? We know that. Many people obviously already understand that, the Constitution is not in effect. There is no rule of law. There is no United States of America, right? If you watch that scene in Network where the corporate guy is, there are no nations, there are no peoples, right? And, he has a more, there's just dollars and whatever. He believes in money. But anyway, point of the story is that Lockheed has become sort of an interesting confluence. And I mean, any sort of national defense, whatever sort of thing, plays this role, right? It's CIA, NSA, all these sorts of things. It's like on the one hand, these are the sorts of organizations which are at the forefront of our military dominated order, right? I mean, you can talk about the Senate and the House and the president all you want, but this sort of the presidential election, you'll very rarely ever hear me talk about that because I think it basically doesn't matter. And I realize a lot of people are like, oh no, Donald Trump is so dangerous, yada yada. But it's like we're already in a very dangerous situation. And the situation is being decided not by elected representatives, but basically by military commanders, people who, are developing and deploying disruptive technology. So I'm not that concerned with who's president of the United States. I'm concerned with who's programming the most advanced artificial intelligence systems, right? I'm concerned with, the board of directors of OpenAI. I'm concerned with, whatever, people like that, people who, people in the Lockheed Skunk Works or the CIA, Digital Innovation Division, Miss Julianne Galina, or Avril Haines, right? The national, the director of national intelligence, right? I already forget the CIA director's name, but I don't get too specific about that because I don't know what's going on, right? I'm not here to tell you like, oh my God, folks, we got to watch out for all these people. Part of what I'm trying to do is to open up a new way of talking about it by saying that, yes, we can acknowledge that when it comes to things like foreign policy, when it comes to things like, what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in Israel and Palestine, the question of who's making these choices and how should we try to influence them is not at all a question of, voting for a representative and, trying to whatever, because in terms of who's really making these decisions, oftentimes it doesn't necessarily have to do very much with, the official channels of government. But at the same time, I'm not trying to sort of be paranoid and judgmental about this. My point is not to say like American democracy has been subverted or whatever, because you've heard me talk about recently Afro-pessimism. I take seriously the idea. I mean, American democracy, don't even get me started, right? I mean, don't even get me started about how you had to have property to vote. Don't even get me started about women not having the right to vote. Don't get me started about black people. And then, we abolished slavery. Great job, right? And then look at the 13th Amendment. Am I even thinking of the right one? I think so, right? There's an exception for people who are in jail, right? And so, but that's okay because we have a rule of law. We have due process. We have a Bill of Rights, which means that if you don't deserve to go to jail, you won't go to jail. Don't make me horse laugh, right? Anyway, but again, the point is not to, denounce the U.S. government. The U.S. government is basically irrelevant. There's no point in getting scandalized about how, people have been using systems of power to dominate each other and they're unfair to each other. It's like, yes, that's how we are, or that's how we have been. And now we're at a point where if we keep up with that game, if we keep up with this where, let me just pretend to be a good person, this Machiavellian stuff, right? Let me just pretend to be a good person and I'll, screw with people behind their back, or, we'll get together and we'll decide that we're the real people. Everybody else is subhuman and we're just gonna, do whatever. It's like, yeah, that's the road to everybody dying, right? Because if you set up this, if your great idea is we're gonna program into a computer who deserves to live and who deserves to die, and the computer will kill everybody for us, it's like that is a way that you are going to die, because continuing to double down on this idea of conflict and this idea of using technology to destroy people. This is not a Christian show, but he who taketh up the AI drone dieth by the AI drone, right? And so much of what there is for us to do at this point is to move past this idea of trying to kill our way to peace. Whether we're talking in this instance about, bombing Palestinians, whether we're talking about killing Ukrainians or killing Russians or whatever, killing the other side is not going to get us where we want to go. Anyway, I've got to take another quick break here, but I'll come back and I'll tell you some details about my grandfather's biography because I want to get this into the public record, and they're not letting me come to Congress for some reason. So until then, I'll be right back after this message.
Access to emergency contraception is more critical now than ever, as abortion and reproductive rights are threatened across the entire Southeast. Plan B can prevent unintended pregnancy up to 72 hours after sex, but barriers like cost limit its use. That's why ARC Southeast created Plan B Southeast, a network of community outposts providing emergency contraception across the Southeast region. We partner with trusted local businesses and organizations to distribute Plan B to their neighbors, expanding access in areas that need it most. As an outpost, you'll empower people to obtain care quickly with no judgment or shaming by simply making Plan B kits that we provide available at normal business hours. Learn about our movement as abortion access is shrinking. Help uplift reproductive justice in your community. ARC Southeast provides the Plan B kits, and your business or organization becomes a pillar of care and compassion. The website is arcsoutheast.org for more information. That's arc-southeast.org. Together, we can make reproductive justice a reality across the South.
This has been another public service announcement from your station for progressive information and handpicked quality music, WRFG 89.3 FM and WRFG.org.
Welcome back. We are here in the third half of the show. And don't forget, this is a call-in program. If you would like to join the conversation here, please feel free to call in. That's 404-523-8989. Again, that's 404-523-8989. Lines have been kind of quiet the last few shows, so also feel free to drop me a line immediately after the show at 1 p.m. if you'd like to let me know why you don't think people are calling in. So anyways, I want to talk to you a little bit about my grandfather. I think it can be powerful for us to mix together, I got my opinions, right? I got my opinions about the deep state and, all this stuff. But I think it is also powerful to mix in, our personal stories. And so that's what I'm trying to do here. So my grandfather wound up working for Lockheed Martin. I'm going to tell the story a little bit backwards. Something I found out just yesterday because I looked up the obituary for my grandfather, and which you can find on the experimental unit subreddit, which again you can find by going to wrfg.org/solution-space, or just search for the Solution Space show page. But so my grandfather, he actually died on September 11th, 1984. And so I was born in 1991, and so this grandfather that I'm talking about, he's the only one of my grandparents that I never met, right? So he died almost 7 years before I was even born, right? So in terms of, again, you're talking about your male role models and all these kinds of things, this is an aspect of my family I never got to experience. Only one of my cousins ever even met this person because he died. He was older than my grandmother. He was born in 1916. My grandmother was born in 1927, I want to say. I always get it confused because Jean Baudrillard, my favorite writer, was born in 1929, which is also the year of the stock market crash, of course. But my grandmother's born in 1927, and so was actually my grandfather on my mom's side. So 1927, but my grandfather was 11 years older, born in 1916, died in 1984. And actually, his birthday is March 13th. So that was yesterday, and so he would have been 108 yesterday, or I guess he is 108, right? It's just been 108 years since he was born, but he died, again, September 11th, 1984, okay? Anyways, so I don't know that much about my grandfather, but I'll just tell you some of the details that I know. So my grandfather saw World War II coming, and he decided to train to be a pilot so that he wouldn't have to be a general infantry, right? So already some kind of privilege, right? Or foresight, right? He could see that a war was coming. And so he decided to learn to fly a plane so he didn't have to be an infantry on the ground. So that worked out. And he wound up being in the Air Force, just like Aaron Bushnell, right? And he did what was called flying over the hump. So again, my grandfather, Theodore Carroll Wadley, senior, my father's a junior, and I was named Adam Stephen. I could have been the third, but that's not how my dad rolls. Anyways, so he flew over the hump, which is to say he flew over the Himalayas, if you'll recall, the tallest mountain range in the world. So he flew between India and China. India, of course, then still a colonial possession of the British Empire, right? And China, he was helping supply the nationalist Chinese forces. But of course, those forces would wind up succumbing to the Chinese Communist Party, and so there was even in the middle of World War II, there was already an ongoing Chinese civil war, that Japan just invaded China in the middle of. But America was trying to help China keep the fight alive so that, Japan would be tied down and things like this. And so my grandfather flew over the Himalayas in a transport plane, and I think he did it like an outrageous number of times. There's one of the members of my family is, the almost stereotypical, conservative uncle, loves to read about Civil War history and do family genealogy and things like this. And so lots of what I know actually is due to him. So shout out, much gratitude. And so apparently my grandfather flew over the Himalayas like 200 times or something like this. He did, I don't know if he was one of the most ever or whatever, but, one of the people who flew over the Himalayas, and this was a very dangerous trip to make, apparently. Not just because of fighting, you might get attacked, or I think my grandfather also saw some combat on the ground, but also in the air, but also just flying over the Himalayas, there's fog, there's tall mountains, it's dangerous, right? But so he did it many, many times. And then he came back to America. And then, so my grandfather also was, he got a business degree, and he always wanted to start his own business. This is another aspect of his story that I think is kind of tragic, right? So he always wanted to start his own business. And so he went to Rome, Georgia, and he was working with his dad, my great-grandfather, and he started basically a soda company. And so he wanted to sell soda. But, there was this other, I think it was called Grapette, right? So a grape-flavored soda. But then, wouldn't you know it, there was this other little company called Coca-Cola, right? And so my grandfather got put out of business by this multinational corporate, well, I guess I don't know if they weren't multinational at the time, but, what would go on to be this, one of the biggest drink company in the world, probably, Coca-Cola. Right? So he got put out of business by Coca-Cola. He was always resentful. And so that's when, he had, it was his duty, right? He was the man, right? He was supposed to earn a good money, right? And this was those halcyon days, the beautiful 50s or whatever, where you could get a good job, right? Of course, my grandfather had an advanced degree, but that aside, he decided to go then work for Lockheed, right? So he had been flying transport planes in World War II, and so he went to work for Lockheed, basically helping doing the parts supply for the same kind of plane and then the upgraded versions of that plane as what he had flown in the war. Okay. So we already mentioned sort of his desire to be a self-made person, his desire to have his own business and stuff, that fell by the wayside. So he couldn't be independent. And I think this is part of the larger trend, right, of our society, right? It's sort of, you might call it the gray man effect, right? Where things are becoming, our society is becoming more bureaucratized, right? And I mean, he wanted to be a Grapette, which was already a license of a bigger company or something. But, there's not even room for Grapette, right? Because it's time for Coca-Cola. It's time for Pepsi, right? It's time for, there's not a million, airplane companies anymore. There's Lockheed, there's Boeing, right? There's Airbus, right? Things are becoming consolidated, especially around, this time. And so my grandfather goes to work for Lockheed, and from what I understand, he didn't particularly enjoy his job, right? He had, a desk job. He was a bureaucrat for this military industrial complex, company, but he didn't really enjoy it. From what I have heard, he would have to mingle sometimes with the other, suits and stuff like that. And my grandmother hated that, right? Anne Brazelton Wadley, may God rest her soul. She died a couple years ago. But, so he didn't really enjoy that. And also, he had a very sort of strained home life. Like my dad will tell a story about my grandfather coming home and just drinking scotch and watching TV and not having that much to say to his own children, right? Because, this corporate job is taking so much out of him. And this corporate job tied up with the military industrial complex, tied up with, these games of imperialism, tied up with this idea of bombing other people to make our problems go away, right? And so we can see the repercussions that this kind of participation, he didn't necessarily have to hate that, whoever he was building, helping build the planes to go attack or something. But, being involved in this sort of corrosive, this very deadening, this very stultifying, this just corporate and state environment where, there's not a lot of interest in, our deeper feelings. There's not a lot of interest in creative solutions to problems. It's sit down, shut up, help us build the plane to go blow up the people, and just be glad you're not one of the people that we're blowing up. Is basically a lot of the mentality. And if you want to talk about, again, sort of models of masculinity, if you want to think about an Andrew Tate or a Donald Trump, right? What is the mentality? Is screw you, I'm getting mine, right? There's actually some interesting stuff going on with this Andrew Tate character, where I think he displays some sympathy toward official enemies. He'll speak. Anyway, I don't want to give this Andrew Tate person too much play. But one of the themes that he's sort of getting at is that, it's all well and good to say like, I'm going to be a real man, right? I'm going to be tough, right? And this doesn't just apply to masculinity. Any time when we feel like, the problem is, people are trying to convince us to, empathize with the bad people, right? What's important is just for us to draw a line in the sand and go scorched earth. And like, that's what the problem is, that we don't have the courage, we don't have the conviction. We just need to go all out and, destroy the people that are bad, right? People will behave in this manner. But, that's not going to work, basically. Again, pick up the sword, die by the sword. And oftentimes, people who adopt this sort of mentality are usually sort of, I don't want to say they're the pawns, but usually this is a sort of mentality which is propagated by people who have a more nuanced view, but they find it to be convenient for other people to sort of be their ideological foot soldiers. And so we need to keep an eye on that as well. Anyway, so wrapping up this thing about my father, at the very end of his time at Lockheed, he wanted to retire. My grandfather also got diabetes, and so then he couldn't fly anymore. And so he was very upset about that. And so he had diabetes and things like this. But then at the end of his time at Lockheed, he wanted to retire, and he was offered to be able to work on classified material. And so my grandfather kept on working for a couple of years just because he was so excited to be able to check out this classified material. So what did he look at? Obviously, I don't know. But as I've mentioned before, Lockheed is this company, involved or, rumored to be involved with the UAP UFO phenomenon. So, they're involved with aircraft development. And so, what's going on in those skunk works, right? What's going on? What is this classified stuff Lockheed is working on? We don't really know. But so when it comes to, here I've got to start wrapping things up a little bit. But so when it comes to, what is it that I'm looking at? Why do I go to these protests, right? Because I don't necessarily see things in the sense that, there's a ruling class, folks. And then Aaron Bushnell was also on this type of rhetoric, right? Talking about the ruling class. But it's like, no group is hegemonic like that, right? So when we talk about the ruling class, right, the people who are in the know, right, the people who are powerful, right, more powerful than the president, if we're able to get over, the scandal, the scandalized nature of that, we're not talking about people who are a monolith. We're talking about individuals. We're talking about people who might feel boxed in, and we're talking about, in the same way that we might try to reach anybody. I think these are people to try to reach, to try to influence, right? Which is, again, not really separate from warfare, right? But I don't like to look at things in terms of war. But, in terms of war, this idea of influence operations, it's not about killing the enemy or whatever, it's about changing their will, right? Changing their decision-making. That's ultimately what there is to do. And so this sort of denunciation, maybe there's a place for it. I understand people are angry. But in terms of what I try to do, the reason why I went to the protest yesterday, and why I'm going to go to the protest at Lockheed. And another thing that I did this week, I went to the Georgia Emergency Management and Homeland Security Office. Nobody ever goes to protest at the places where I want to. Nobody ever wants to go to protest at FBI Atlanta. And anyway, but I go there and I hold my sign. And, it's basically the message is we need to love, or we're all going to die. So we need to be committed to love beyond terms and conditions, beyond nation, beyond gender, beyond tradition, beyond, dogma. And we need to be committed to that, or, we face the possibility that all of us might not be here in a very short amount of time. So that's the show for tonight, or for today. And Destiny willing, we'll see you again next week. Do 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 do.